Horizontal UX, and this is What Even Is Europe by channel Kraut. Yes, and the Kraut video. This is about Europe. I like the title. What even is Europe? Just simply. Are you talking about European Union? Are you talking about the continent? Okay. I'm guessing it's the European Union since it's the flag there. So what even is EU or European Union, or I guess the modern version of European states, which is European Union, right? I'm guessing, this is going to be one of those things like, what is European Union? Is it a one entity? Is it a group? Is it just an agreement? What it is? This is going to be a fun topic. So let's watch it. I've done quite a few Kraut videos. I think I still have one finished video, right? What was that? India and Pakistan. Is that India, China? India and Pakistan. I haven't finished it. It's been a while since I finished it, but yeah, I'm going to do that. It causes issue with YouTube somehow. So I have to record it in advance and I have to post it later, but usually I don't have time, But when I find time, I'll make a video, post it, put it up for review or whatever, before YouTube like, oh, it's fine. But yeah, let's watch it.
This video is about the European Union, specifically examining it within the context of European history and how we should interpret and understand it in that context, what the purpose of the European Union may be, and what the European Union means for the future of Europe. This video is also sponsored by Enlisted. Enlisted is a first-person shooter set during the Second World War. You can play the game for free on PC, Xbox and PlayStation. It includes campaigns set in the Pacific, the Eastern Front, the Battle of Normandy and...
What is with this, man? Look at that. Free-to-play games. Obviously, they're going to make money out of microtransactions and things. I don't know. But look at the free-to-play games. How are they looking? Look at that. This fucking thing is ridiculous. Look at the graphics. How far gaming industry has come, right? Whenever you saw, free-to-play games before, you're like, oh, it's going to be somewhat mildly fine-looking or even worse-looking game, but fine, you can play with multiplayer, it's going to be fine. But look at this shit now. Nowadays, all the free-to-play, this kind of games that just looks awesome.
Of Africa. I personally prefer playing the Pacific campaign the most, since that scenario is often ignored by other games. If you played first-person shooters before, you should feel right at home. You join the game
holy shit, look at the textures, man.
Specialization, from infantryman to sniper, machine gunner, tanker or flamethrower. As you progress with your squad through the game, you will earn XP points to upgrade your squad and gear. There are also various different game modes to choose from invasion, that positions one team on the defense while the other has to take the ground, to armored train escort, where one side has to protect an armored train from another. You can download and play the game for free by using the link in the description. If you use that link, you will also gain access to 3 days of premium time and several orders for troops and weapons. Thank you to Enlisted for sponsoring this video. Conversations about...
Seriously, is that a cinematic clip that he used, or is it actual part of the gameplay? Because did you saw the fucking textures on the gun? This is the best detailed looking graphical way game I've seen, free to play at least, and not even free to play, in any game. I haven't seen that kind of textures on a gun in a long time, even in Call of Duty.
About the historical context of political development in which we ought to understand the European Union are some of the most divisive of our time. We Europeans love to tear each other apart over this issue. What even is the European Union? How should we understand the development of the European Union in the context of historical political developments? I'm going to make this video opening that can of worms to enjoy the circus and chaos that will evidently result in the comment sections. One of the most insightful perspectives I ever got on...
See, Kraut is so controversial that not just him, even my reactions have comments like, oh, this is biased, Kraut is biased, isn't it? Man, everybody's biased in a way, right? So far, everything I've seen with the knowledge I already had kind of makes sense. But yeah, obviously there's always going to be people like, oh, this is just one-sided view. Everything's a one-sided view. You can never find a center. If you want to find center, everything has to end with a question like, this is the source. Is it true?
What the European Union may be is from a conversation I had with a viewer from China in my Discord server. He told me that from his perspective of interpreting history as a Chinese national, the worst thing that ever happened to Europe was the collapse of the Roman Empire. He draws parallels between the history of Rome and the histories of the Qin and Han dynasties. Both set out on the task of unifying their regions and binding a patchwork of cultures together under a civilization state. But whereas the Qin and Han succeeded in creating the foundations of a Chinese civilization state, the Romans failed. For centuries to come, different Europeans would desperately try to revive the project of the European civilization state, to create a middle kingdom of Europe of sorts, but all of them failed. Instead, Europe became a place of deep divisions which undermined the creation of a unified European civilizational polity, and instead created nations. They expanded outside of Europe by imperialism in attempts to collect the resources needed to unite Europe. By mistake, created American civilization and exported their systems of ethnic and religious political divisions to places like Africa and Asia. This European imperialism ultimately failed, and the European Union, from his perspective, is the latest attempt to finalize and create.
Okay, first of all, comparing China and Europe is like, both are the same entity. Europe, divided into nations where China didn't. China is one fucking nation. I don't care how big China it is, right? If you see the China's map, most of it is mountainous, right? Only the eastern and southern type of the places where you can actually live, right? All the northeastern and even some of the middle places are mostly mountainous. You can't even live. So you can't really compare, China is so big, Europe is so big, we can compare because, the Roman Empire existed at the same time, these dynasties existed, you can compare that. That's not the same way, right? And saying that Europe constantly collapsed is not stable, but China established a stable society is kind of a stupid way of seeing things, in a way, right? Because sure, right, you can find similarities between those dynasties and today's China, but is that better, right? Is that really stability, right? All the modern invention, every advancement in human civilization, most of it can be traced back to Europe. In the modern times, it can't trace back to USA because USA became a thing in past few centuries. But if you're going to see since the Romans' time, mostly it was European, and you can in a way even say that USA is also part of Europe, right? That's where they came from, right? And lots of scientists were German and European as well there. So maybe you need this kind of turmoil and changes in order to advance, right? It's like, lots of Indians, my people basically sometimes say, we are the oldest civilization here and there. Sure, there's truth to that, but it's not that simple, is it?
Create a post-imperial unified European civilizational state. He explained that to him and to many of his Chinese compatriots, the European Union is viewed favorably. For if it would come to be as a civilizational polity that unifies Europe, they believe that its emphasis on social democracy and regulated markets over the ruthless capitalism of the United States will lead to a split between the two and thereby further the creation of a multipolar world. Now, I do not agree with our Chinese viewer. In particular, his concept of civilization and his geopolitical biases are also very clear. But nonetheless, I find it very interesting and worth presenting. It certainly is an interesting perspective on how European imperialism came to be, but it also gives a twist on a popular way of interpreting history. In essence, our Chinese friend is saying, actually, you Europeans are the backward ones. We Chinese resolved the question of establishing a common civilizational polity over 3,000 years ago, while you failed. You instead adopted the nation, and the nation is a political regression that is inferior to the civilizational polity. But you Europeans are gradually on the road to accomplishing what we Chinese accomplished 3,000 years before you.
Why does he think that the goal of unifying is the ultimate goal? See, there's every question's end goal. They just assume that this is the goal everybody want to have. Maybe they want to stay as different nations. They don't want to have unified nations, unified society, unified power, or whatever the shit that is, right? And again, comparing Europe to China feels weird. Like you can't really, one is a fucking continent, one is a country. Right? Sure, there was two entities rose up around the same time, but it's not the same, right? But overall, just being smug about it, like, oh, we established 3,000 years ago. Is it better? Is it better though? Right? There's this kind of a saying. Maybe you need changes and turmoils in order to move forward, because maybe as soon as you stabilize, that's the start of a downfall, right? There's a saying like, once you reach the top, now the downfall starts because you already reached the top. There's only way to go is go down. Maybe you need changes and turmoil to move forward, right? Maybe they're happy with all the different nations. They don't want to unify. Why are you assuming that unifying one state is the ultimate goal? Like, no.
you, and we welcome your progress. Now, I disagree with this narrative, but there is one thing in particular regarding European political development on which our Chinese friend is, in my opinion, correct. The European Union is a post-imperial political project. A project that not only strives to overcome conflict among nation states, but a project that seeks to build an alternative to imperialism. Overcoming conflict between nation states is one of the main stated goals of the European political project. The common fiction that many Europeans tell themselves to be the foundation of the European Union is the myth of the state that learned from history. That Europeans, after decades of bloodshed and violence, decided to learn from history. Determined that to avoid conflict, Europeans needed to learn to share among themselves, and therefore created a unique system of international cooperation. Far-right critics of the European Union often invoke an opposing political fiction, the golden era of nationalism from the 1920s to 1930s, that the collapse of European empires during the First World War led to the almost natural development into smaller nation-states based on nationality defined through language or ethnicity, who supposedly existed in peace. Now, besides the fact that anyone who praises the politics of 1930s Europe is always kinda suspicious anyway, this idea is also generally untrue. The interwar period was not an era of peace. In fact, this era contains the most wars fought in Europe during the 20th century. The Soviet invasion of Georgia.
Who thinks that period is period of peace? Like, what the fuck? Anybody said 1990 or 1938, everybody just start to, just stand up straight like, whoa, what the fuck? They know what's coming.
The Soviet invasion of Armenia, the Soviet invasion of Azerbaijan, the Soviet invasion of Ukraine, the first Soviet invasion of Poland, the first Soviet invasion of Finland, the first Soviet invasion of Estonia, the first Soviet invasion of Lithuania, and the first Soviet invasion of Latvia.
There's a trend here, isn't it?
What these wars, almost all involving the Soviet Union, show us is that the death of Central European and Eastern European traditional empires almost instantly resulted in the re-emergence of new European empires to take their place.
Power vacuum.
Especially the early 1920s, saw an extremely aggressive new Soviet empire attempting to conquer and subjugate much of Eastern Europe. Now, to be fair, right-wing historians acknowledge this.
What the hell? Oh, it just switched to 4K. Kraut is making 4K video, alright.
And they describe communism as an attempt at eradication of the nation-state by a new form of imperialism. However, here is something that far-right historians often tend to ignore. The Polish-Ukrainian War, the Georgian-Armenian War, the Georgian-Turkish War, the Armenian-Azerbaijani War, the Greek-Turkish War, the Polish-Lithuanian War, the Hungarian-Romanian War, the Hungarian-Czechoslovak War, the Greek-Bulgarian War, and the Czechoslovak-Polish War. The interwar period saw almost all new nation-states born from the First World War engage in border disputes and expansionist squabbles over who owned what. Often these squabbles were not even about ethnic or lingual groups who lived on disputed lands, but over resources. The Czechoslovak-Polish War was, for example, fought over a region of Silesia that was majority Czech and German, but which the Poles wanted because of its enormous coal deposits. The reason for all of these conflicts is that the idea of a self-limiting nation-state did not exist at that time.
Yeah, the coal thing reminds me of a lot of, now I'm not saying most of it, but a lot of wars can be traced back to need for energy. Oil, coal, whatever. There's always something like that. So I feel like the day we achieve some kind of a free energy, source, like like there was a news just now, right? How we achieved a stable, nuclear fusion energy in a way, right? We achieved a stable way because sure we can have an unstable reaction, that's a fucking bomb, but stable reaction, that is a hard thing to get. And there was a big progress just now, which just tells us that in future nuclear fusion reactors can be possible. And once that happens, you have the energy, like holy shit, you're creating mini suns here on the planet, and you won't need anything else. You won't need oil, you won't need coal, hell, you won't even need solar power. You feel like small and like frivolous, right? You can use solar panel, sure, but nuclear fusion will create a lot of energy that any of the solar panel would get. So once that happens, I think a lot of wars would go down, because every time there's like an ethnic issue or religious issue or whatever, when you peel it through, usually it's just greed of some kind. Maybe it's oil involved, maybe it's coal involved, something like that to get rich, right? Very rarely it's true religious or ethnic wars. Very rarely, especially in Europe, right? So yeah, in future we're gonna see decrease of that at least. But yeah, again, I don't. Every time people like there's certain entity trying to establish whether they use any imperialism, right? They communism, whatever new ideas they take to create one powerful nation, this and that. But I think in future that's not going to be the case, right? I mean, assuming that everybody wants to stabilize into one big idea or one big nation, otherwise the conflict's going to be there. I think once the free energy becomes easy, that idea is going to go away, right?
Nationalism, as created in the 1800s right up to the 1920s, was a political force that in fact actively tried to build spheres of influence over peoples outside of one's respective nationality. Many European nationalist movements in fact built upon an idea of their own cultural or ethnic superiority and saw it as part of their nation-creating mission to domineer over others on that basis. The self-limiting nationalism that argues for a nation-state that deliberately shuns spheres of influence over others is not even a Western European political innovation, but a Turkish one. Atatürk was the first political thinker to formulate that idea in the late 1920s. It is one of the founding pillars of Kemalism and the reason why Kemalists advocate for Turkish isolationism. In many ways, our modern understanding of nationalism was invented by the Turks. The collapse of European empires is similar to the collapse of Yugoslavia, resulting in the emergence of fresh states who instantly engaged in petty squabbles over who owned what and who was what. The way Serb nationalists formulated political fictions that declared Montenegrins as an inherent cultural part bound to Serbia in many ways reminds me of how the Czechs created a fiction of the Slovaks as an inherently bound part of Czechia. There was no golden age of European nation-states and nationalism, as many right-wing critics of the European Union claim. The era of European nation-states were 2 decades of war and instability, and it is this squabbling and conflict between states that is the mission of the European Union to overcome. Many non-Europeans often overlook this aspect and purpose of the European Union and of modern European politics: reconciliation. In 1984, the French President François Mitterrand and the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl met at Verdun, the site of the most vicious fighting of the First World War. They stood at the coffin of an unknown soldier who was draped in the flag of both nations, held hands and attended over a ceremony of remembrance together. Rituals like these are a core component of the success of the European project and have to be maintained for that project to continue and succeed. We tend to overlook the importance of ritual in politics, but rituals, no matter how much they may or may not be formalized, lie at the center of all political engagement. And the rituals of reconciliation are an important pillar of what the European Union is built upon. It is a promise that enables economic cooperation in the first place. Some non-Europeans often dismiss this as little more than an expression of a supposedly masochistic German guilt. But these state rituals, in fact, should not be labeled as such. They are essential to creating a political understanding of preserving a common peace, and they are not only conducted by Germany. When the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe ended, all the newly liberated countries engaged in foreign policies of reconciliation and peace to overcome any and all enmities that may still remain from the interwar period. Bulgaria and Greece also underwent this process of reconciliation during the 1920s, so did Italy and Greece before. But this process has also on occasion failed, most prominently between Hungary and many of its neighbors. The Orban government, through its constant denial of the sovereign integrity of its neighbors, is a factor that continuously undermines and challenges the core foundation of reconciliation in European politics. A process of reconciliation and friendship between Greece and Turkey was successful throughout the 2000s, but then unfortunately collapsed during the 2010s. But by far the biggest failure in European reconciliation was with Russia. 2 consecutive German governments invested in an energy policy that they believed would result in an economic codependence that would guarantee peace. And while there was hope in the early 2010s of a reconciliation between Russia and Poland, Russia eventually destroyed any hopes of reconciliation with Europe. So to summarize, one of the
See, the problem with that is if Russia was all in European Union and kind of was dependent with its economy on it, it would have been fine. But what happened was Russia just became like, I don't give a shit. I don't give a shit about economy, anything. Even if it tumbles down, I'll somehow persevere. That became an issue. And now you have only issue like energy, which is like a crucial component. I'm dependent on Russia. That's what happened with Europe. This is just fucked up. See, with the European Union, only thing I can really think about is that throughout the years, whenever there's a power vacuum or some empire dies, there's always a friction. This belongs to me, this belongs to me. There is my ethnic people live in your side, your ethnic people live in my side. Basically, Middle Eastern issue that we have, right? Usually it's ethnic, but also mostly it's related to riches and finance, right? Money related. So when you make this kind of a web of economic dependency on each other, creates this kind of a open border type of thing, right? Regardless of you have my ethnic people there, I have your ethnic people here. Borders are just like lines on a map. It's all open in the end. When you do that, in a way, national borders kind of disappear. That's what's kind of happening in European Union. If you go to one country or another, there's barely a flag there. They're telling you, okay, now you're entering Switzerland, or now you're entering Italy. And all are abiding by European Union rules. So it kind of becomes one nation. Imagine if that happened in Middle East. All the issue would go away, right? Because the borders are what causing the issue. Drawing the borders that the way British and French, I think I think they did in the way, that's causing ethnic and lots of issues, right? And this is causing issues. But when you have something like European Union, borders kind of become symbolic in a way. But you are all living in European Union in a way, right? So this was crucial, right? What didn't happen in Middle East right now, I don't even know if it's going to happen in the future, but that happened in Europe because for 1,000 years, God knows how many wars happened, right? When you see the Wikipedia page, it's just ridiculous how many wars are there. So let's create this kind of a one nation type of mentality, but not really. But let's create a mentality, economy that depends on each other. Everybody hold hand, right? We'll all get rich together or whatever. That is kind of working.
Foundations of modern Europe as a political entity is not the destruction of individual nation states, but the facilitation of peace through reconciliation. And importantly, as Russian gas shows us, reconciliation must come before economic cooperation. And to ensure cooperation can continue, this process of reconciliation, as well as the rituals of reconciliation, must be continued. Those who disrupt this process should be sanctioned for doing so. And if the European Union is to expand, it must export this process as a requirement to those who wish to apply. Another aspect of understanding the European Union in its political context of development is to create a political system of organization that can persevere in a post-imperial age. And this is where I agree but also disagree with our Chinese friend. There's a political thinker from before the European Union whose ideas in many ways predate the European Union, but can also in some ways be found within the aspects of the European Union, be it intentional or not. Józef Piłsudski, the leader of the First Polish Republic. The political mission of his state was a political idea that is largely forgotten today, called Prometheanism. Piłsudski and other Polish intellectuals of the Polish independence movement believed that imperialism was a form of political organization that was doomed to fail, and that they lived during the era of its demise. Poland was one of the first nations to attain independence from the death of imperialism, and it was therefore Poland's national duty to not build a new Polish empire, but to hasten the process of killing imperialism in its entirety. And Poland's principal target of this ought to be the destruction of Russian imperialism by supporting any and all independence movements within its borders, because Russian imperialism was the primary threat to Polish statehood. Piłsudski also correctly asserted that the Soviet Union was not a new means of political organization, but just a rebranded Russian imperialism. As part of Prometheanism, Poland ought to help create a geopolitical sphere called the Intermarium, a federation of all states in a triangle between the Baltic, Black and Adriatic Seas, as a common economic and military alliance against the aggressive imperial ambitions of Russia, Germany and Italy. Now, none of this ever came to be. If it had, it would have probably prevented the Second World War. Poland itself ended up bickering with many of its neighbors throughout the European nation-state bickerings of the 1920s and 1930s. But the historical realities aside, there is a core truth to what Piłsudski believed, and an important truth as well. The key to overcoming and resisting imperialism is for nation-states, who would usually fall victim to imperialism, to cooperate together. Piłsudski's ghost can very much be seen in the policies of the former Soviet bloc in Europe. cooperation to withstand outside aggression. And this in some sense is one of the key promises of the modern European project. Reconciliation does not only offer the prospect of economic cooperation, but comes with the promise of protection from empire, to create a political structure that can overcome empire. Curiously enough though, almost all the founding countries of the European Union were not nation-states, but European empires. They either still had overseas empires or were recent European empires. Britain was also an empire when it joined. It is important to acknowledge and admit the fact that the European Union was created by dying and dead empires, who sought out a means of existence after empire. This also helps us understand modern political myths and misconceptions. A large part of the Brexit campaign, for example, was driven on the promise of returning to an imagined great past when Britain was just a nation-state. This is a lie. Britain never existed as a nation-state before the European Union. It only existed as an empire. When Britain joined the common market, it was still an overseas empire that could hitch onto its foreign properties to stay afloat and dictate policies to others. Britain joined so it could take part in cooperation with Europeans to stay afloat as its empire died. Britain, as a sole nation-state without an empire, only exists since 2016 after Brexit, and the British, through that decision, are now forced the hard way to confront the fact that they are no longer an empire and no longer in a position to dictate policy to anyone. In many ways, the European project came to
Yeah, with the Britain thing, it's fucking ridiculous, right? They wanted to have free, open trading. They wanted the same type of economical, rules with the European Union. But at the same time, they didn't want to be part of European Union. That's what European Union was, right? European Union is kind of like toleration of each other. So we don't just kill each other over petty squabblings. If you leave European Union, it's not going to be same. Otherwise, you're part of European Union or not. There's no other factor like that. So nation states can exist, sure. But in Europe, throughout the years, it's been like, it's hard, right? Without friction, something like that existing is hard. So we don't know what's going to happen to Britain going forward, because after Brexit, this kind of COVID time kind of masked if there is any problem or not. But since now that is over, pandemic is kind of over, right? Now people start to feel the effect of Brexit. So we don't know what's going to happen next 2-3 years, let alone long one, how hard it's going to be. But yeah.
Similar conclusions as Pilsudski and the Prometheans had in the 1920s. The foundations of a post-imperial political order must be cooperation of nation-states and the abandoning of imperial ambitions. This harbors potential conflict in Europe's future. France is Europe's last empire. And one thing our Chinese viewer is correct about is that European empires used resources from colonies to gain advantages in the power struggles of Europe. France also uses its overseas spheres of influence, in particular in Africa, to gain advantages in Europe today and thereby cause resentments and hinder European integration. An example, France is proud of its energy independence through nuclear power. Half of the French nuclear fuel comes from Canada, but the rest comes from mines in its African sphere of influence. If it loses its African sphere of influence, it will either have to purchase more expensive nuclear fuel from Canada, Australia or the United States, or turn to a European solution of cooperation. Ukraine has the largest uranium deposits in Europe. To get cheap Ukrainian uranium, France would have to stop blocking Ukrainian European Union membership. But through this compromise, it would have to allow Ukraine to sell its cheap agricultural produce to compete with French agricultural produce. As you can see, the fact that France still clings on to remnants of its empire comes as a detriment to a further European integration, because it means that France can avoid compromises that it else would have to make.
That's a problem.
That is the core sacrifice that every participant in the European project makes. Everyone always has to compromise. Everyone has to make some sacrifices in order to benefit together with all in common. France keeping its empire gives it an unjust advantage in the process, and many European countries are increasingly unhappy with this. To maintain cooperation with Europe, France will have to probably let go of its influence in Africa in the near future. And here is where I disagree with our Chinese friend. I do not see the European political project as just another empire or the attempted creation of a European civilization of polity as a player in a multipolar world. I believe its model of national cooperation is a framework that in the long term can undermine the entire concept of polarity and create a post-imperial world. And for that to succeed, the concept must also be promoted abroad. This is something often pointed out by Portuguese politicians who argue that Europe should seek deeper ties, cooperation and trade with the Mercosur, African Union and ASEAN rather than with the United States. That Europe should promote national cooperation through the Mercosur, African Union, ASEAN.
I mean, imagine right now if India, Pakistan, China, right, Indonesia, all these places had something like European Union. They cooperated. How many friction would have gone away, right? I mean, Pakistan's economy was kind of doing bad a few months ago. I don't remember exactly. Sri Lanka literally collapsed. That wouldn't have happened, would it? If there was a mutual agreement like this and economical, dependence on each other. So this is basically the next phase in global society, basically, right? Cooperating, making sacrifices here and there, and just tolerating each other. So there is no friction, right? European Union is what's going to be normal going forward.
As an alternative to being in an American sphere of influence or a Chinese sphere of influence. In summary, that cooperation between nation states as a political development can function as a mechanism to overcome imperialism and create the post-imperial world. Thank you again to Enlisted for sponsoring this.
Yeah, this was a good video. See, people always criticize European Union, but that's kind of the idea of it is kind of the future thing, right? Moving forward, nations will have to do that, whether they like it or not. Because friction will always be there if you cling on to one nation mentality, right? If you want to go global, which we have done in past few decades, right, with everything, look at the travel, look at the all the trading, dependence on each other. If you want to make an iPhone, you have to import shit from Australia, China, and 40, 50 other nations, all the different equipment just to make one iPhone. This is what we are at right now, right? So the borders either have to be completely removed, which is not going to happen, or you have to come across some kind of an agreement that makes borders just suggestive at best, like European Union. If you lived in EU, you can go to Germany, Switzerland, whatever, there's barely anything there. Maybe a post that's telling you, okay, you're entering a new country or whatever, right? So you need something like that. I mean, look at the Britain now. Britain's going to face a massive issue just in transport because now there's going to be paperwork involved, which otherwise wouldn't have, right? So yeah. Alright, well, that was What Even Is Europe by the channel Kraut. If you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.